Weekend Getaway. Part 1. The Decision. Lauren sat in the dimly lit kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound that broke the silence. She looked at her phone, hoping for a message, a call, something from Jason, but nothing. The screen remained blank, just like her marriage lately. They had been married for 8 years, long enough for the spark that once burned brightly between them to fade into something distant. Jason was successful, working long hours as an investment banker, his time consumed by deals, meetings, and never-ending emails. He had become a stranger in their home, leaving early and returning late, his attention always elsewhere. Their conversations had dwindled to mundane exchanges about bills, grocery lists, and maintenance on the house. She missed the way he used to look at her, the desire in his eyes. Now she felt invisible. Lauren, in her early 30s, was still captivating, her blonde hair falling in effortless waves over her shoulders. Her petite frame, honed from morning yoga sessions, often went unnoticed by her husband. Her beauty, once something that made her feel alive and cherished, now felt like a burden, something she carried for no one to appreciate. The isolation of their relationship gnawed at her, leaving a void she couldn't ignore. It was during one of Jason's business trips that she met him, Ryan. A mutual friend had invited her to a casual dinner, and Ryan, a dark-haired, ruggedly handsome man, had been there. His smile was disarming, and the way he looked at her made her feel seen again, like the woman she used to be. There was no denying the chemistry between them. One drink had turned into 2, then 3, and before she knew it, they were laughing and exchanging flirtatious glances, a playful energy sparking between them. She felt alive in his presence, the attention he lavished on her intoxicating. Ryan was nothing like Jason. He was a freelance photographer, spontaneous, with a sense of adventure that made her feel giddy, reckless even. He listened when she talked, touched her when she needed reassurance. They began exchanging messages, harmless at first, just jokes, casual conversations. But soon, the texts became more frequent, more charged with the tension of something forbidden. Late-night messages, stolen moments, secret fantasies whispered between them. And then one day, he suggested it. A weekend away. Just the two of them. A secluded cabin, far from the city, far from the reality of her life. Lauren's pulse had quickened at the thought. She hesitated, torn between guilt and desire, but the pull of being wanted, being adored, was too strong to resist. Jason hadn't even noticed when she mentioned the girls' weekend. He had barely glanced up from his laptop, muttering something about being busy at work, his mind already elsewhere. It was the perfect cover. He trusted her implicitly, never questioning her plans, never suspecting that his wife was seeking solace in the arms of another man. Now, as she stood in the cozy kitchen of their suburban home, staring at the suitcases by the door, Lauren felt a thrill of excitement, mixed with a pang of guilt. Could she really go through with this? The thought of Jason sitting alone in their empty house, oblivious, made her stomach twist. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore the magnetic pull toward Ryan. The cabin was in the mountains, secluded and quiet, the perfect place for their secret escape. She could already picture it, sitting by the fire, the warmth of the flames casting a glow over their bodies, his hands on her, reminding her of what it felt like to be desired. With one final glance at her phone, Lauren slipped on her oversized sweater, the soft fabric clinging to her curves in just the right way. She ran her fingers through her tousled blonde hair, took a deep breath, and walked out the door. The drive to the cabin felt like the beginning of something dangerous, something exhilarating. As the city faded behind her and the road wound through dense forests, her anticipation grew. The isolation was palpable, the feeling that she was leaving behind the life she had known for so long, stepping into something forbidden. When she arrived, Ryan was already there, waiting for her by the porch. His smile was easy, his dark hair tousled in the breeze. The moment their eyes met, the tension between them crackled like electricity. "Missed you," he murmured as he pulled her into a tight embrace, his lips brushing her ear, sending a shiver down her spine. Lauren felt the weight of her guilt dissolve in his arms. Here, in this secluded cabin, away from everything, she wasn't a wife with a neglected marriage. She was just a woman, longing to be loved, to feel alive again. But as they stepped inside the cabin, the shadows of reality crept in. Despite the isolation, Lauren couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not by anyone outside, but by the looming presence of her guilt, of the husband she had left behind for this fleeting moment of passion. Part 2. The cabin. The air in the cabin was thick with the smell of pine, and the lingering warmth from a fire Ryan had already started. Lauren's eyes scanned the room, rustic but cozy. The walls were lined with wood, and a large stone fireplace dominated the far wall, its crackling flames dancing in the low light. A large worn leather couch sat in front of it, an inviting space for two. The windows stretched tall, offering a view of the dense woods that surrounded the cabin, giving the sense that they were utterly alone. As Ryan dropped her bags by the door, Lauren's heart pounded, torn between excitement and guilt. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her the way he did. His eyes lingered on her as she slipped off her sweater, revealing the soft, curve-hugging tank top beneath. The oversized garment fell to the floor, forgotten, as his gaze trailed over her petite frame. "You look incredible," Ryan said, his voice a low rumble. He stepped closer, his hand brushing her arm lightly before it moved down to her waist, pulling her toward him. His touch was electric, sending a wave of warmth through her. For a moment, Lauren closed her eyes, letting herself fall into the feeling of being desired again. Ryan's hands on her felt different from Jason's, a reminder of what passion could feel like when it was untainted by routine, obligations, and time. But just as she let herself relax into the moment, the sharp trill of her phone broke the silence. She jumped, pulling away from Ryan, her heart racing for an entirely different reason now. The screen lit up. Jason. Her husband. Her pulse quickened. She fumbled with the phone, debating whether to answer. A wave of panic washed over her. What if he knew? What if he had somehow found out? No, that was impossible. He had no reason to suspect anything. She had been careful. Ryan stepped back, giving her space but watching her with a knowing look. "It's him, isn't it?" Lauren nodded, biting her lip. She stared at the phone, feeling the weight of her double life pressing down on her. She couldn't ignore the call. That would look suspicious. Swallowing her fear, she forced a smile and answered. "Hey, babe," she said, trying to sound casual, her voice just a little too bright. Ryan was watching her with an amused smile, leaning against the kitchen counter as if they weren't standing in the middle of something forbidden. "Hey," Jason's voice came through, tired but warm. "Just checking in. How's the girls' weekend going?" Her stomach twisted as the lie rolled off her tongue. "Oh, it's great, we're just settling in. The place is beautiful, exactly what I needed." "That's good," Jason replied. There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment, Lauren's mind raced. Could he hear something in her voice? Could he sense the tension, the guilt lurking beneath her words? "Well, I won't keep you," he finally said. "Just wanted to make sure everything was going okay. I'll let you get back to your weekend." "Thanks, babe. Talk soon," she said, her voice shaky as she ended the call, her hand trembling slightly as she set the phone down. Ryan stepped closer, his dark eyes gleaming with mischief. "You're a terrible liar." Lauren let out a shaky laugh, her nerves still buzzing. "I've never had to be one before." He wrapped his arms around her, his lips brushing the side of her neck. "You're doing fine." But she wasn't sure. The call had unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. The thrill of being here with Ryan was undeniable, but it was tethered to the nagging fear of being caught. The guilt was always there, lurking in the back of her mind, threatening to crash through the carefully constructed facade she had built. To push the unease aside, Lauren tilted her head back, letting herself melt into the feeling of Ryan's lips on her skin. His hands slid down her sides, pulling her closer, and for a moment, She lost herself in the heat between them. His touch was intoxicating, and she needed this, needed to feel wanted, needed to feel something that wasn't the dull ache of a marriage slipping through her fingers. Ryan's hands explored her body with a familiarity that came from their stolen moments together over the past few months. Every touch felt like a rediscovery, a reclaiming of the woman she used to be. The one who wasn't invisible, who wasn't just waiting for attention that never came. Here in this secluded cabin, she was the center of Ryan's world. But as his lips found hers and the heat between them deepened, a noise outside made her jump. The sound of rustling leaves, the crack of a branch snapping underfoot. She froze, pulling away from him, her heart hammering in her chest. "What was that?" she whispered, her eyes darting to the window. Ryan glanced toward the door, but he was unconcerned. "Probably just the wind, or an animal. We're out in the middle of nowhere, remember?" But Lauren couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. The isolation that had once felt liberating, now felt claustrophobic. She was trapped here, hiding from the life she had left behind, and for the first time it felt real. Too real. Ryan pulled her back toward him, his hands soothing on her arms. "Relax, no one's going to find us here. It's just you and me." She nodded, trying to convince herself that he was right. But as the night wore on, the sense of unease settled deep in her bones. Each creak of the cabin, each distant sound from the woods, felt like a reminder of what she was risking, what she stood to lose if everything fell apart. Part 3. On edge. The wind howled outside, sending gusts of cold air rattling against the windows. But inside the cabin, the fire crackled warmly, casting shadows across the walls. Ryan had disappeared into the kitchen, busying himself with opening a bottle of wine, while Lauren stood by the window, staring out at the darkness beyond the trees. The isolation had seemed thrilling at first, a getaway from everything, from her stifling routine, her absent husband. But now, in the quiet, with only the sounds of nature surrounding them, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, pale and wide-eyed. She had dressed casually for the trip, an oversized sweater, a pair of soft shorts that barely grazed her thighs. But now, standing there, she felt exposed, vulnerable. Her tousled blonde hair fell around her shoulders, framing her face in a way that reminded her of how Ryan had looked at her when she arrived. The way his gaze lingered on her as if she were something precious, something he had waited for. It was thrilling, Ryan's attention. But with Jason's phone call still fresh in her mind, a pit of anxiety gnawed at her. What if she slipped up? What if she said something wrong? She had already lied to him once, and it had been harder than she had imagined. The guilt was a constant presence, whispering in the back of her mind, reminding her that this moment of freedom, was built on lies. Ryan returned, 2 glasses of red wine in hand. He handed one to her, his fingers brushing hers briefly as he did. His smile was warm, disarming, and she tried to let herself fall back into the fantasy they had created. A weekend away, just the 2 of them, no one else to worry about. "To us," he said, raising his glass. Lauren managed a small smile and clinked her glass against his. "To us." They drank in silence for a moment, the tension between them palpable. Ryan's dark eyes flicked over her body, and Lauren felt the heat of his gaze like a physical touch. She took another sip of wine, hoping it would dull the edge of her nerves. "You're still thinking about him, aren't you?" Ryan asked, his voice soft but pointed. Lauren blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "Jason," Ryan said, taking a step closer to her. "I can see it in your eyes. You're here, but you're not. You're thinking about what he'll say, what he'll do if he finds out." Lauren's stomach twisted. Ryan was right, of course. No matter how much she wanted to escape, Jason was always there, hovering in the back of her mind, a reminder of the life she was betraying. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Ryan set his glass down on the table and closed the distance between them, his hands finding her waist. He pulled her close, his breath warm against her ear. You don't have to worry about him right now. He's not here. It's just you and me. Let's forget everything else. His words were tempting, and for a moment, Lauren wanted to believe them. She wanted to lose herself in him, in this cabin, in the fantasy they had built together. She wanted to forget about Jason, about her marriage, about everything that weighed on her. But the guilt was there, nagging, refusing to be ignored. Ryan's hand slid up her sides, his touch gentle but insistent, and Lauren felt her resolve begin to crumble. She closed her eyes, leaning into him, letting his warmth envelop her. For now she could pretend. For now, she could be someone else. But as their lips met, a soft vibration broke through the moment. Her phone, again. Lauren froze, pulling away from Ryan just as her phone buzzed on the table. Her heart raced as she picked it up, her hand trembling slightly. It was a message from Jason. Everything okay? Haven't heard from you in a while. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. It was an innocent enough message, but the guilt that accompanied it was overwhelming. She felt Ryan's eyes on her, his expression unreadable as she stared down at her phone, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She had to reply. Not answering would only make things worse. Yeah, everything's fine, she typed quickly, her fingers shaky. Just been busy with the girls. She hit send and set the phone down, feeling the weight of her lie settle over her like a heavy blanket. How had she gotten here? How had she let things get so out of control? Ryan reached for her hand, his touch pulling her back into the present. You're safe with me, he murmured, his voice low. No one's going to find out. You deserve this, Lauren, you deserve to be happy. Did she? She wasn't so sure anymore. Ryan's hand slid down her arm, his fingers trailing over her skin, sending shivers down her spine. He leaned in, his lips brushing hers once more, and for a moment, she let herself believe it. She let herself fall into him, into the warmth of his embrace, into the fantasy they had created. She kissed him back, harder this time, trying to silence the voice in her head that kept reminding her of everything she was risking. But as they moved to the couch, the shadows dancing on the walls, the flickering flames casting a soft glow over their bodies, that voice refused to be silenced. Each time the phone buzzed, each time her mind drifted back to Jason, the weight of her choices grew heavier. Ryan's hands moved over her, pulling her closer, his touch urgent now. The isolation of the cabin, the very thing that had drawn them here, now felt suffocating. Every creak of the wooden floor, every gust of wind outside, felt like a reminder that they were living on borrowed time. And time, Lauren knew, had a way of catching up with you. Part 4. The Friends Post. Morning light streamed through the curtains, casting soft rays across the room. Lauren stirred under the thick blankets, feeling the warmth of Ryan's body beside her. His arm was draped lazily over her waist, his breath slow and even. For a moment she allowed herself to sink into the comfort of it. No guilt, no worry. Just the quiet intimacy of the cabin, far from the life she had left behind for this brief moment of escape. But the feeling didn't last. As she reached for her phone on the nightstand, the glow of the screen pulling her back to reality, her heart skipped a beat. Notifications, messages, missed calls, and a string of social media alerts blinked up at her. She hesitated before opening them, her stomach twisting with unease. Something wasn't right. One notification in particular caught her eye. A tag in a post from one of her friends, Michelle. Her pulse quickened as she tapped on it, her eyes scanning the photo that had been posted late last night. It was a selfie, taken at a bar, a casual night out with the girls, just as she had told Jason. But there was something in the background. Something that made Lauren's heart drop into her stomach. There, barely visible over Michelle's shoulder, was Ryan. He wasn't looking at the camera, but he was unmistakable. His dark hair, the way he carried himself, there was no doubt it was him. And worse, she was in the photo too. She hadn't even noticed it being taken, but there she was, sitting beside him, her face half turned toward him as they shared a drink, laughing, too close for comfort, too intimate for it to look innocent. Lauren's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the image, her mind racing. How could she have been so careless? Michelle must have accidentally posted the picture, not realizing what it showed. But the damage was done. The photo was out there, visible to anyone who scrolled by. What if Jason saw it? Her fingers hovered over the screen, panic rising in her chest. She could try to delete the tag, ask Michelle to take it down. But the longer she waited, the more likely it was that someone would notice. What if one of Jason's friends saw it? What if it made its way back to him? Ryan stirred beside her, sensing her tension. He propped himself up on one elbow, his eyes still heavy with sleep. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low and groggy. Lauren didn't answer right away. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the screen, from the image that felt like a ticking time bomb. She handed him the phone, her fingers trembling. "Look." Ryan's brow furrowed as he took the phone from her, his eyes narrowing as he studied the photo. For a moment, he was silent, and then he let out a slow exhale. "Shit." "Yeah," Lauren whispered, her voice barely audible. "What if Jason sees this? What if someone tells him?" Ryan set the phone down and sat up, running a hand through his tousled hair. "It's not a big deal. We're just in the background. It's not like anyone's going to connect the dots." But Lauren wasn't so sure. Jason might not be the type to monitor her social media obsessively, but all it would take was one friend noticing, one comment made in passing, and everything could unravel. The life she had kept so carefully compartmentalized, the secret she had tried so hard to protect, was now teetering on the edge of discovery. "I need to get her to take it down," Lauren said, her voice rising with anxiety. "I can't risk it." Ryan reached for her hand, his touch meant to calm her, but it only heightened her awareness of how precarious their situation was. "Relax, babe, you're overthinking this. It's one picture. Just tell her to delete it." Lauren nodded, her thoughts spinning. She quickly sent a message to Michelle, trying to keep her tone casual, even though her heart was racing. "Hey, could you take down that picture from last night? I look terrible in it, lol." It was a weak excuse, but she couldn't think of anything better. She waited, holding her breath as the seconds ticked by, her eyes glued to the screen. A response finally came through, and Lauren exhaled in relief. "Sure. Sorry about that. Didn't even notice you in the background. I'll delete it now." Lauren's chest loosened, but the panic hadn't completely subsided. The picture might be gone, but the sense of unease lingered. She was walking a tightrope, balancing her life with Jason on one side and her affair with Ryan on the other, and the rope was fraying. Ryan, sensing her continued tension, pulled her closer. "It's fine. No one saw it, and it's gone now. We're in the clear." But Lauren couldn't shake the feeling that their secret was hanging by a thread. One slip, one wrong move, and everything could fall apart. "Maybe we should be more careful," she said quietly, her fingers tracing the edge of her wineglass from the night before. "I don't want to get caught." Ryan kissed her shoulder, his lips soft against her skin. "We won't, I promise." But as the morning wore on, Lauren couldn't help but feel like the walls were closing in. The cabin, once a place of escape, now felt like a trap. She glanced at her phone again, half expecting a message from Jason, some hint that he had seen the photo, that the lie was already unraveling. But there was nothing, just silence. Still, the unease gnawed at her. She knew she couldn't live in this suspended state forever. The fantasy was starting to crack, and the reality she had been running from was creeping in at the edges. It was only a matter of time before something gave way. Part 5. Guilt and Distance. The day passed in a haze of tension. Despite Ryan's efforts to keep things light and carefree, Lauren couldn't shake the growing weight in her chest. Her mind kept drifting back to the photo, to Jason, and to the life she was jeopardizing. Every vibration of her phone made her stomach lurch, expecting the worst. Though Michelle had taken down the post, the damage felt done. Lauren knew she was living on borrowed time. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a soft orange, the sun dipping behind the trees. The warm light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the cabin. Ryan was in the kitchen again, prepping dinner, his movements casual and relaxed, as though nothing had changed. But for Lauren, everything felt different. She sat curled up on the couch, staring at the flames in the fireplace, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside her. She had wanted this escape for so long. She had fantasized about it during the lonely nights when Jason worked late, or when his attention was more focused on his phone than on her. She had craved the passion, the excitement, the feeling of being wanted. But now, as she sat here in this cabin, far from home, the reality of what she was doing weighed heavily on her. Lauren's phone buzzed again, pulling her out of her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat as she glanced down at the screen, but it wasn't a message from Jason. It was a group chat with her friends, another reminder of the life she was pretending to live this weekend. "We should do this more often," one of her friends had written, followed by a string of excited emojis. The message was filled with light-hearted chatter about their next girls' weekend, oblivious to the fact that Lauren wasn't actually with them. It made her chest tighten with guilt. She quickly typed out a response, trying to keep up the lie. "Totally. Can't wait for the next one. Miss you guys already." As soon as she hit send, she set the phone down and buried her face in her hands. How had her life gotten so messy? Every lie she told seemed to pile on top of the others, building a fragile tower that could collapse at any moment. Ryan walked over with 2 glasses of wine, interrupting her spiral of thoughts. He handed her one, sitting down beside her on the couch. "You're quiet," he said, his voice soft but probing. "I know something's bothering you." Lauren took a sip of the wine, trying to gather her thoughts. She didn't know how to put her feelings into words. She had been living in 2 different worlds for months now, and the strain was starting to show. "I'm just feeling guilty, I guess," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan frowned, leaning closer. "About Jason?" She nodded, staring down at the glass in her hands. "I never wanted to hurt him. I didn't plan for any of this. But now, it's like I'm lying to everyone. To him, to my friends, even to myself." Ryan reached out and gently lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You don't need to feel guilty. Jason is the one who neglected you. You deserve to be happy, Lauren, and he hasn't made you happy in a long time." His words were meant to comfort her, but they only made the ache in her chest worse. Yes, Jason had been distant. Yes, their marriage had lost its spark. But did that justify what she was doing now? Did it make the lies any easier to live with? "I don't know if this is worth it," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ryan's expression darkened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Anger, frustration. "What are you saying? That you regret being here with me?" Lauren shook her head, feeling the sting of his words. "No, it's not that. I don't know if I can keep living like this, lying all the time, sneaking around. It's exhausting." Ryan's jaw tightened. He set his wine glass down on the table with a little too much force, the sound breaking the uneasy silence between them. "You knew what this was when we started," he said, his tone clipped. "I've given you everything I can. What more do you want?" Lauren flinched at his sharp tone, her heart racing. She hadn't expected this conversation to go this way. She had hoped for reassurance, for understanding. Instead, she was met with cold reality. Ryan wasn't interested in the complexities of her emotions. He wanted her, on his terms. And if she wasn't willing to play along, then that was her problem, not his. "I'm not saying I don't want this," she said quickly, trying to diffuse the tension. I don't know how much longer I can keep up the charade. I don't want to hurt anyone." Ryan sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're overthinking it, Lauren. We're careful. No one's going to find out." His words did little to soothe her. The photo, the close call, was proof enough that they weren't as careful as they thought. And even if no one ever found out, the lies were eating away at her. The longer she stayed in this web of deception, the more trapped she felt. Ryan leaned back, his frustration evident. "Look, if you want out, just say it. I won't stop you." Lauren looked at him, her stomach churning. The easy, passionate man she had run to was suddenly distant, defensive. The carefree, thrilling affair was unraveling before her eyes, exposing the cold truth beneath. She was playing with fire, and Ryan's indifference to her inner turmoil was gasoline on the flames. "I don't know what I want," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, Ryan didn't reach for her. He sat there, staring at the fire, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Lauren felt the weight of it pressing down on her, suffocating her. As the sun set, casting the room in shadows, Lauren couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something that could shatter her life in ways she wasn't prepared for. Part 6. The Call. The next morning, a heavy fog had settled over the cabin, cloaking everything in a thick, quiet mist. The world outside felt distant, almost surreal, but the tension between Lauren and Ryan was all too real. They had barely spoken since their conversation the night before, the air between them thick with unresolved emotions. Lauren sat by the window staring out at the fog-covered trees, her mind a tangle of guilt and confusion. She sipped her coffee, the warmth doing little to comfort her as her thoughts spiraled. The weight of her double life pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything was slipping out of control, that this weekend was spiraling toward an inevitable crash. Ryan was in the kitchen, his movements quieter than usual. She could feel the distance between them, the passion and excitement that had once fueled their affair now replaced by something colder, more distant. The reality of what they were doing had finally caught up with them, and Lauren wasn't sure if they could go back to the way things were before. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at it, her stomach twisting when she saw Jason's name on the screen. It wasn't a text this time, it was a call. Her heart pounded as she stared at the phone, frozen in place. Ryan looked over from the kitchen, his brow furrowing when he saw the name on the screen. "You're not going to answer?" Lauren's fingers trembled as she reached for the phone. "I have to." She stood up and moved to the far side of the room, as far away from Ryan as she could get. Taking a deep breath, she swiped the screen and brought the phone to her ear. "Hey," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Hey, babe." Jason's voice came through, warm and familiar. "I just wanted to check in. How's the weekend going?" Lauren forced a smile, even though he couldn't see it. "It's good," she said, her voice sounding false to her own ears. "Just hanging out with the girls, relaxing, you know how it is." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and Lauren's heart raced, terrified that Jason could somehow sense the lie in her voice. "Yeah, I figured," he said finally, his tone casual. "I miss you though. The house feels empty without you." Lauren's throat tightened. She hadn't expected him to say that, and the words hit her harder than she thought they would. Jason wasn't the most affectionate man, but there was a tenderness in his voice now that made her chest ache with guilt. He missed her, and here she was, lying to him, betraying him. "I miss you too," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ryan shot her a look from across the room, his expression hardening. He didn't say anything, but she could feel his silent judgment. He didn't like hearing her talk to Jason. It was a stark reminder that she belonged to someone else. "I'll let you get back to your weekend," Jason said, breaking the silence. "I just wanted to hear your voice." Lauren swallowed hard, her heart heavy. "I love you," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment she wondered if Jason had heard her. Then, softly, he replied, "I love you too, Lauren." The call ended, and Lauren stood there, her phone still clutched in her hand. She felt like she was being torn in two. Part of her wanted to run back to Jason, to apologize, to make things right. But another part of her, the part that had brought her here in the first place, couldn't let go of Ryan. She couldn't walk away from the passion, the excitement, the escape. Ryan stood up from the kitchen counter, his eyes dark with frustration. "What was that?" he asked, his voice cold. Lauren frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "You just told him you love him," Ryan said, his tone sharp. "Do you even know what you're doing? You're lying to him, lying to me. You can't have it both ways, Lauren." She recoiled at his words, feeling the sting of his accusation. "It's not that simple," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't understand." "No, I understand perfectly," Ryan shot back. "You're trying to live two lives, and you're going to end up losing both." The harshness of his words cut deep, and for a moment, Lauren didn't know how to respond. He was right, of course. She was trying to live in two worlds, and the walls between them were starting to crumble. Before she could say anything, her phone buzzed again. Lauren glanced down at the screen, her heart stopping when she saw a notification from one of her social media apps. She opened it, her hands shaking, and her blood ran cold. It was another tag, this time from one of Jason's friends. Someone had seen the photo before Michelle had taken it down. The message was innocent enough, a comment on the group's night out, but the photo had been shared again. And this time, Jason could see it too. Lauren's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the screen, panic flooding her veins. She hadn't thought to check if anyone else had shared the photo before it was deleted. She had been too focused on Michelle's post. And now, it was out in the open again. "Lauren?" Ryan's voice cut through her panic. "What's going on?" She didn't answer. Her fingers trembled as she quickly tried to remove the tag, but it was too late. Jason would see it. If he hadn't already, someone would surely point it out to him. The picture wasn't incriminating on its own, but the context, the closeness between her and Ryan, the fact that she wasn't where she said she was, it was enough. Ryan came over, glancing at her phone. His eyes darkened as he realized what had happened. "You need to call him." Lauren shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't." "You don't have a choice," Ryan said, his tone urgent now. "If he sees that picture before you explain." Before he could finish, her phone rang again. It was Jason. Lauren's heart stopped. She stared at the screen, her mind racing, panic flooding her body. She couldn't answer. She couldn't face him. But the phone kept ringing, louder and louder in the stillness of the cabin. Ryan grabbed the phone, his face pale. "Lauren, you need to." But in his haste his finger slipped, and he answered the call. "Hello?" Jason's voice came through, confused and cautious. Ryan froze, his eyes widening in panic. Neither of them spoke, the silence on the line deafening. "Lauren?" Jason's voice was sharper now, laced with suspicion. "Who is this?" Ryan quickly ended the call, but the damage was done. The look on his face said it all. Lauren stood there, her mind blank with shock. Jason knew, or at least he suspected, and there was no taking it back. Part 7. Panic sets in. The cabin felt suffocating in the wake of Jason's call. The walls, once a cozy refuge, now pressed in on Lauren, trapping her in the chaos she had created. She stood frozen, her breath shallow, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound of Jason's voice still echoed in her ears, the suspicion clear. He had heard Ryan's voice. He knew something was wrong. Ryan paced across the room, his hands running through his hair in frustration. "I'm sorry," he muttered, shaking his head. "I didn't mean to answer it, I panicked." Lauren didn't respond, her mind spinning too fast to focus on his words. Her phone buzzed again in her hand, another message from Jason. She stared at the screen, unable to bring herself to open it. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, threatening to suffocate her. "What are you going to do?" Ryan asked, his voice low, as if trying to contain his own panic. Lauren swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I don't know. she whispered, barely able to get the words out. I don't know how to fix this. Her phone continued to buzz, Jason's name lighting up the screen over and over again. Each ring sent a fresh wave of panic through her, the reality of the situation crashing down on her like a tidal wave. She had been so careful, so convinced that she could keep her two worlds separate. But now everything was unraveling, and there was no way to stop it. You have to talk to him, Ryan said, his voice firmer now, though it carried a sharp edge of anxiety. If you don't, he's going to keep calling. You need to explain something. Lauren shook her head, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Explain what? How do I explain this? He heard you, Ryan. He knows I'm not with the girls. Ryan stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression hardening. You don't have to tell him the truth. You can say I'm a friend, someone you bumped into. Make something up. Lauren felt her chest tighten at his suggestion. She had been making things up for months, little lies, excuses to cover her tracks. But this wasn't a little lie anymore. This was her entire life teetering on the edge of destruction. Jason wasn't an idiot. He would see right through any half-baked story she tried to spin. I can't just lie to him, Lauren said, her voice cracking. Ryan's eyes flashed with frustration. You've been lying to him this whole time. What's one more lie? Lauren recoiled at his words, the coldness in them cutting deep. She had always justified the lies to herself, convincing herself that she wasn't really hurting Jason, that she was just looking for something she wasn't getting at home. But now, faced with the reality of her choices, the guilt was overwhelming. Ryan stepped closer, his voice softening. Listen, I know this is hard, but you can't just ignore him. You need to take control of this before he starts digging into things. Lauren nodded, even though her mind was still spinning. She knew Ryan was right. She couldn't just let the situation spiral out of control. But how was she supposed to talk to Jason now? What could she possibly say to make this right? Her phone buzzed again, and this time she forced herself to look at the screen. It was a text from Jason. Jason. Who was that on the phone? Why didn't you answer me? Lauren's heart sank as she read the message. There was no escaping this. Jason knew something was wrong, and he wasn't going to let it go. She stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the screen. She wanted to respond, to somehow make it all go away, but every word that came to mind felt like a lie, and she was sick of lying. Ryan sighed and sat down on the couch, his own frustration evident. If you don't want to lie, then what? Are you going to tell him the truth? Are you ready for that? Lauren looked at him, her stomach twisting. The truth. Could she really tell Jason everything? Could she admit that she had been lying to him, sneaking around behind his back, falling into the arms of another man? The thought of the hurt in his voice, the pain she would cause, made her feel sick. But wasn't it better than dragging this out? Wasn't it better than living in constant fear of being caught, of everything blowing up in her face? I don't know, she whispered, her voice shaky. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Ryan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Look, I get it. This is a mess. But if you want to keep your life with him, you have to find a way to handle this. Maybe it's time to end things with him. Be with someone who actually gives you the attention you deserve. Lauren blinked at him, the weight of his words hitting her hard. Ryan was suggesting that she end her marriage. That she walk away from Jason, from the life they had built together. The very thought of it made her chest tighten, but there was a small part of her, hidden deep beneath the guilt and confusion, that wondered if he was right. Was this affair a sign that her marriage was already over? That she was just clinging to something that no longer existed? She stood up, needing space, needing air. She couldn't breathe in this cabin anymore, couldn't think straight. The fog outside mirrored the fog in her mind, thick and impenetrable. She walked to the door and stepped outside, the cool air hitting her like a slap to the face. For a moment she just stood there, her arms wrapped around herself as she tried to calm her racing heart. She felt torn in two, one part of her desperate to go back to the life she knew, the safety of her marriage with Jason, and the other part of her unable to deny the pull she felt toward Ryan, the thrill of their affair, the passion she hadn't felt in years. The sound of her phone buzzing again broke through her thoughts. She glanced down at the screen, her stomach twisting into knots when she saw another message from Jason. Jason. Lauren, we need to talk. Call me. Lauren's hands shook as she stared at the message. She knew she couldn't put this off any longer. She had to talk to him, had to face the consequences of her choices. With a deep breath, she typed out a response, her fingers trembling. Lauren. I'll call you later, just give me some time. She hit send, her heart racing as she waited for his response. A minute later, another message appeared. Jason. Fine, but we're not letting this go. Lauren's chest tightened, the reality of the situation pressing down on her like a weight. She was out of time. She couldn't keep running from the truth. Sooner or later, everything was going to come crashing down. Part 8. Confronting the truth. Lauren stood on the porch of the cabin, staring into the fog-covered woods, her heart heavy with dread. The air was thick and still, the silence only amplifying the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She had bought herself a little more time with Jason, but it wouldn't last. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the life she had so carefully crafted crumbling before her eyes. Behind her, Ryan stepped out onto the porch, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor. She didn't turn to face him, but she could feel his presence, a quiet tension in the air between them. He had been right about one thing. She couldn't keep living this way, caught between two worlds. But what was she supposed to do now? You okay? Ryan's voice was low, cautious. Lauren shook her head, her arms wrapped around her body as if trying to shield herself from the weight of her decisions. I don't know how to fix this, she whispered. I don't know how to make this right. Ryan was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, there was an edge of frustration in his voice. Maybe it's not about fixing things, Lauren. Maybe it's about moving forward. She turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face for some kind of reassurance. What does that even mean? Moving forward to what? I don't even know if I want this anymore. Ryan's expression hardened, his frustration finally bubbling to the surface. What are you saying? You're having second thoughts now, after everything we've done? Lauren felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had never meant to hurt anyone, but here she was, standing in the wreckage of her choices, with no idea how to rebuild. She wasn't even sure what she wanted anymore. The thrill of the affair, the escape Ryan had offered, it had all felt so intoxicating, so freeing. But now, standing on the edge of losing everything, she wasn't sure if it had been worth the cost. I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what I want. Ryan's eyes darkened with anger, his jaw tightening. So, what? You're just going to run back to him? Pretend none of this ever happened? I don't know. Lauren's voice cracked, the weight of her indecision overwhelming her. I can't think straight right now. Everything is falling apart, and I don't know what to do. Ryan took a step toward her, his frustration giving way to something softer, more vulnerable. I get that you're scared, but don't forget why you came here in the first place. You came because you weren't happy with him. You came because you needed something more. Lauren blinked back tears, her heart heavy with guilt. But look at what I've done. Look at the mess I've made. Ryan reached out, his hand gently touching her arm. You didn't make this mess alone, Lauren. I'm in this with you. We can figure this out, together. His words were meant to be comforting, but instead, they only added to the weight pressing down on her chest. She had thought she wanted this, thought she wanted Ryan. But now, she wasn't so sure. The idea of losing Jason, of destroying her marriage, filled her with a sense of dread she hadn't anticipated. The sound of her phone buzzing in her pocket made her stomach lurch. She pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat when she saw yet another message from Jason. Jason. We're talking about this tonight, Lauren. No more excuses. Lauren's hands trembled as she read the message. Tonight. It was happening tonight. She would have to face him, confront the lies, the betrayal. And once she did, there would be no going back. She turned to Ryan, her voice thick with emotion. I have to go. Ryan's face darkened. What do you mean, you have to go? I can't stay here anymore, she said, her words coming out in a rush. I need to go back, talk to Jason. I need to figure out what's left of my life before it's too late. Ryan's expression shifted from anger to something close to desperation. You can't just walk away from this. From us. Lauren's chest tightened at the word us. For a while, she had believed in it, in the idea of her and Ryan, escaping the dullness of her life with Jason. But now, with everything unraveling around her, she wasn't sure if there was an us anymore. Maybe there never had been. I don't know if there is an us, Ryan, she said softly, the words painful to say. Maybe this was never meant to be anything more than an escape. Ryan stared at her, his jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with a mix of hurt and anger. So that's it? You're just going to throw this away? Throw me away? Lauren shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I don't know what else to do. For a moment they stood in silence, the tension between them thick and heavy. Ryan looked at her with a mix of disbelief and disappointment, his face hardening as he realized she was serious. Fine, he said finally, his voice cold. Go back to him. See how that works out for you. Lauren flinched at the bitterness in his words, but she didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. She turned away from him, walking back inside the cabin to pack her things. Every step felt heavy, like she was walking through quicksand, each moment dragging her closer to the inevitable confrontation with Jason. She quickly gathered her belongings, stuffing them into her overnight bag with shaking hands. Ryan stood in the doorway, watching her silently, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't try to stop her, didn't say another word as she packed. The silence between them was deafening. When she was finally done, she walked to the door, pausing for a moment as she looked back at Ryan. He was still standing there, his expression unreadable, but the hurt in his eyes was unmistakable. Goodbye, Ryan, she said quietly, her voice barely audible. Ryan didn't respond. He just watched her go. Lauren stepped outside, the cold air biting at her skin as she walked toward her car. She felt numb, like she was moving on autopilot, her mind too fogged with guilt and regret to process what was happening. As she climbed into the driver's seat, her phone buzzed again. Another message from Jason, reminding her of the conversation they would have that night. She stared at the screen, her heart sinking. She had no idea what she was going to say to him, no idea how to explain everything she had done. But one thing was clear, there was no escaping it anymore. The lies, the affair, the secrets, they were all about to come crashing down. And Lauren wasn't sure if she was ready for the fallout. Part 9. The Ride Home. The drive back to town felt longer than it had ever been. Lauren gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she navigated the winding roads through the woods. The trees blurred past her, but her mind was somewhere else entirely, consumed by the looming confrontation with Jason. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was late afternoon, the gray sky hanging low, casting a somber tone over the landscape. She still had a couple of hours before she'd be home, but the knot in her stomach tightened with every passing mile. What was she going to say to him? How could she even begin to explain what she had done? Her phone, sitting on the passenger seat, buzzed again. She didn't need to look at the screen to know it was Jason, sending yet another reminder of the conversation they would have tonight. Each buzz felt like a ticking clock, counting down to the moment she could no longer avoid. No more excuses, no more hiding behind lies. Her thoughts drifted back to Ryan. The way he had looked at her before she left the cabin, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and anger, played over and over in her mind. She had expected him to fight for her, to try to stop her from leaving, but he hadn't. Instead, he had let her walk away without so much as a goodbye. For a moment, she wondered if she had made the wrong choice. What if Ryan had been right? What if her marriage with Jason was already dead, and she was just delaying the inevitable? The affair had been born out of her loneliness, out of her desire for something more than what her life had become with Jason. But now that everything was on the line, she wasn't sure she could walk away from the life they had built together. Lauren bit her lip, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The guilt, the regret, the fear of what was coming, it was all too much. She had thought she could control it, keep her affair with Ryan separate from her life with Jason. But it had all come crashing together, and now there was no escaping the consequences. As she rounded a curve in the road, her phone buzzed again. She couldn't take it anymore. The constant reminders of what was waiting for her back home were too much to bear. She reached over and picked up the phone, her thumb hovering over Jason's latest message. But before she could open it, another notification popped up, an alert from a social media app. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw the name of one of her friends from the group chat, the ones who were supposed to be her alibi this weekend. The notification was a new post, a photo from the cabin trip they had all taken a few months ago. Lauren's heart sank as she opened the app, her eyes immediately locking onto the picture. It was an innocent enough photo, just her and a few of her friends smiling in front of the cabin, their arms wrapped around each other in a group hug. But then she saw it. In the background, barely visible, was a reflection in the cabin window. A reflection of a man, Ryan. Panic surged through her. She hadn't noticed him in the background before, and apparently neither had her friends when they had posted the picture. But now, in the cold light of her impending confrontation with Jason, the significance of the image hit her like a freight train. If Jason saw this photo, if he noticed Ryan in the background, everything would be over before she even had a chance to explain. Her hands shook as she quickly scrolled through the comments. Thankfully, it didn't seem like anyone else had noticed Ryan, but it was only a matter of time. She couldn't believe how careless she had been. All of her careful planning, the lies, the cover stories, it could all come crashing down because of one careless moment captured in a photo. Lauren pulled over to the side of the road, her heart pounding in her chest. She quickly typed out a message to her friend, her fingers trembling. Lauren, hey, I just saw your post from the cabin. Can you take it down? I look terrible in that pic, and I don't want it up. Thanks. She hit send, praying that her friend would take the photo down without asking too many questions. The minutes ticked by as she sat in her car, her stomach in knots, waiting for a response. Finally, her phone buzzed with a reply. Friend. Oh no, you don't look bad at all. But if you really want, I'll take it down. No worries. Lauren let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She watched as the post disappeared from her feed, the immediate threat of exposure fading, at least for now. But the sense of relief was short-lived. The larger problem was still looming ahead of her. Jason. She tossed the phone back onto the passenger seat, feeling the weight of what was coming settle back onto her shoulders. She had avoided disaster for the moment, but the bigger storm was still waiting for her at home. The rest of the drive passed in a blur, her mind replaying 1,000 different scenarios of how the conversation with Jason would go. Would he yell? Would he be calm? Would he already know the truth, or would she have to confess everything? By the time she pulled into the driveway of their suburban home, the sky had darkened, and the lights inside the house were on. Jason was home, waiting. Her heart raced as she turned off the engine, her hands shaking as she grabbed her bag and stepped out of the car. The house looked the same as always, but tonight it felt like the threshold to a different life, one that she wasn't sure she was ready to face. With each step toward the front door, her chest tightened. She fumbled with her keys, her fingers trembling as she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of their home hit her, a mixture of Jason's cologne and the faint smell of dinner. Jason was sitting in the living room, his face illuminated by the soft glow of a table lamp. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the silence between them thick and heavy. "Hey," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of tension. "Hey," Lauren replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She dropped her bag by the door and walked into the living room, her heart pounding in her chest. The moment had finally arrived, and there was no turning back. Jason stood up, crossing his arms over his chest as he studied her. His eyes were sharp, searching her face for something she wasn't sure she could hide. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but firm. Lauren nodded, her throat dry. "I know." She sat down on the couch, her legs feeling weak beneath her. Jason remained standing, watching her with a mixture of suspicion and hurt. She could feel the weight of his gaze, pressing down on her like a stone. "What happened this weekend, Lauren?" Jason asked, his voice laced with quiet accusation. "And don't lie to me." Part 10. The Moment of Truth. Lauren could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, the weight of Jason's question pressing down on her. She had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, she was at a complete loss for words. Every possible lie, excuse, or half-truth seemed to dissolve in the air between them, leaving her exposed. Jason didn't sit down, didn't make this any easier for her. He stood over her, arms crossed, his eyes piercing. There was an edge in his voice that she had never heard before, a mixture of suspicion, hurt, and barely controlled anger. "Lauren," he said again, this time more firmly, "what happened this weekend?" She swallowed hard, her mouth dry. She had been rehearsing this moment in her mind the entire drive home, but now the words wouldn't come. She looked down at her hands, wringing them in her lap, trying to find a way to begin. "It was just a girls' weekend," she said softly, her voice shaky, hoping to buy herself some time, to feel out how much he already knew. "I told you that." Jason's eyes darkened. "You expect me to believe that? After everything?" Her heart skipped a beat. Everything? What did he mean by that? Had he already found out? The photo flashed in her mind, the one her friend had posted, the one she had been able to take down just in time. But had it been too late? Had Jason seen it before it was deleted? "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously, her voice trembling. Jason let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I mean, I'm not an idiot, Lauren. I know something's been off for months now. You've been distant, distracted, always with some excuse to go out with friends or take a weekend trip. And this weekend, you didn't even sound like yourself when I called." Lauren's breath hitched. She remembered the call earlier that day, when Jason had called during one of those tense moments in the cabin with Ryan. She had tried to sound normal, but clearly, she hadn't pulled it off. Jason took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "So I'm going to ask you again, and I want the truth this time. Who were you really with this weekend?" Lauren felt like the walls were closing in around her. Her mind raced, desperately searching for a way out, but there was none. She couldn't keep lying. Jason already knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. The truth was inevitable now, and the thought of saying it out loud terrified her. I was with the girls," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "But Ryan came up too." Jason's face changed in an instant, his eyes widening, his jaw tightening. "Ryan?" he repeated, his voice dangerously low. "As in Ryan from your office? The same Ryan who's been texting you all the time lately?" Lauren's heart sank. She had tried to be so careful, but clearly, Jason had noticed things she hadn't even realized. She could feel the blood drain from her face as she nodded, unable to look him in the eye. Jason let out a breath, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely controlled. "How long have you been lying to me?" Tears welled up in Lauren's eyes, her chest tightening with guilt and fear. "I'm so sorry, Jason. I didn't mean for it to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." Jason's face contorted with anger. "How long, Lauren?" he repeated, his voice rising. Lauren closed her eyes, the truth finally spilling out, even though it felt like it was ripping her apart. A few months, since spring. Jason turned away, pacing across the room, running his hands through his hair in frustration. He looked like he was trying to hold himself together, but barely succeeding. His breathing was ragged, his movements jerky, as if he was on the verge of losing control. Lauren couldn't hold back the tears anymore. They streamed down her face as she watched Jason's world shatter in front of her. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, but she knew it wasn't enough. Nothing she could say would ever be enough. Jason stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and rage. "How could you do this to us?" he demanded. "To me? After everything we've been through? After everything I've done for you? This is how you repay me?" His words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had expected anger, but hearing the pain in his voice broke something inside her. She had been so wrapped up in her own dissatisfaction, her own feelings of loneliness and neglect, that she hadn't fully considered the damage she was doing to Jason. Seeing it now, laid bare in front of her, was almost unbearable. "I never wanted it to go this far," Lauren cried, her voice breaking. "I was lonely, Jason. You were always working, always too busy for me. I felt like I didn't matter to you anymore." Jason's eyes flashed with fury. "So you decided to have an affair? That's your solution?" Lauren shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I wasn't thinking straight. I know it was wrong. I didn't know how to fix what was broken between us." Jason stared at her for a long moment, his chest heaving with emotion. Then he turned away, walking to the window and staring out into the night. The silence between them was suffocating, the weight of everything that had been said hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Finally, Jason spoke, his voice quiet but full of hurt. "I gave everything to this marriage, Lauren. Everything. And you threw it away for what? For some fling." Lauren's heart broke at the sound of his voice. She wanted to explain, to make him understand that it hadn't just been about Ryan. It had been about the emptiness she had felt for so long, the disconnection between them that she hadn't known how to bridge. But how could she expect him to understand that now, when all he could see was her betrayal? "I don't know how to make this right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jason turned back to face her, his expression hard, but his eyes filled with pain. "I don't know if you can." Those words hit her harder than anything else. The finality of them. The possibility that there was no way back from this, no way to repair the damage she had caused. For a long time they stood in silence, the enormity of what had happened settling over them like a heavy fog. Lauren could feel the weight of her choices pressing down on her, suffocating her. She had thought she could control it, that she could have both Ryan and her marriage, but now she saw how foolish that had been. Jason finally spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. "I need some time to think. I can't do this right now." Lauren nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She watched as Jason turned and walked down the hallway, disappearing into their bedroom. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house, and suddenly, Lauren was alone. She sank onto the couch, her body trembling with sobs as the reality of what she had done crashed over her. She had destroyed everything. Her marriage, her life with Jason, everything they had built together. And for what? A few moments of escape, of feeling desired again? As the tears flowed, she knew that no matter what happened next, whether Jason decided to forgive her or not, things would never be the same again. The life she had known, the life she had taken for granted, was gone. And she had no one to blame but herself.